And
Wendy?
this is a presentation of the Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland and the Master Gardeners of Cuyahoga County and the Shaker Lakes Garden Club. And we come to you monthly with interesting programs that encourage you to actually create significant and biodiverse habitats in your own yard. And so each month we have a speaker that gives you insights and tidbits and how to and a big picture, a little picture, ideas about how you can do that. And if you haven't already, we also encourage folks to register their yards and have a team of volunteers come out and help you on this journey of converting your landscape from alien and exotic and invasive species to native species. We are all following the gospel of Doug Ptolemy. So bringing nature home. I'm Harvey Webster, your host of this, and today we had a cancellation. Unfortunately, Matt Valensic, who was scheduled to do I'm sure would be a fascinating program on good bug, bad bug, unfortunately could not do the presentation. So I went back into my grab bag, my archives, and came up with a program called All About the Virginia Opossum. And so I'm going to take you down a little path as we explore the natural and cultural history of the Virginia opossum. And why is this significant? Because opossums are indeed very much a suburban animal, and they're an animal that could be in your yard. And let's just say that they've got sometimes a bad reputation, and we're going to explore whether that reputation is deserved or maybe not. So with that, I'm still waiting to see if a few people might log on. While we're doing that, I will give you one natural history observation in my backyard in Kirtland, Ohio. This is kind of cool. So Doris, my wife Doris, and I were looking out the kitchen window one day, and there was a brown lump in the middle of our grassy area by our bluebird bushes. And this big brown lump looked like it had, been a big fluffy brown meteor that had struck our backyard and created a shallow crater. But in reality, it was a jake. It was a 2-year-old tom turkey, and it was in the process of taking a dust bath. And this dust bath went on for the better part of almost 20 minutes. And this turkey would be on its side. And this little shallow depression was one area. There's many areas in the backyard where nothing wants to grow. But anyway, wildlife is putting it to good use. And the turkey would get in there on one side and it would stretch its foot out and it would kick the dirt up on top across of its neck and head. And then it would go and do the other side. It almost looked like it wanted to roll on its back like a dog. It was the darndest thing we'd ever seen. And of course, dust bathing is very common in birds. And the prevailing theory is that by saturating your feathers with dust, it helps, kind of like diatomaceous earth helps combat ants. It helps control whether feather lice or mites or those types of ectoparasites you might have on you, and whether wild turkey are getting plagued as much as you and I are getting plagued by the mosquitoes of this rather wet and mosquito populous summer. I don't know, but it was an amazing thing. But the funniest thing is that then, after doing this for 18, 19 minutes, it stands up and it struts about maybe 4 or 5 paces. And then you could see it raising up all of its feathers. And then all of a sudden it does that, as birds do to get all their feathers to lay back in their proper place. But with that, this giant cloud of dust emanated from the turkey flight for a brief second. You literally couldn't see the turkey. It was really the most remarkable thing we'd ever seen. And we've seen it now twice. On 2 occasions, this turkey has taken a dust bath in the same location. Okay, I see the Kathleen's on. So maybe this is going to be our intimate group, but we're going to go right on into it. So I am going to share my screen and share. And I'm doing that. And I'm going to start from the beginning. From the beginning. Okay, everybody can see that, I hope? Good. I'm assuming you can. So today's program, the totally awesome opossum, natural and cultural history of our only native marsupial. I should define that. The only native marsupial to the United States. So what is an opossum? Well, the opossum is that we're talking about is the Virginia opossum, Didelphis virginiana. Care that whenever you see a scientific name, the name of a person's name at the end is generally the person who first described the species to science. And this is a little baby opossum on its mom's back. And this is a pretty interesting animal, but before we get into some of its attributes, what is it? Is it an opossum or possum? What gives with a name? Well, actually, a name means a whole lot. Possums are a name that refers to marsupial mammals from Australia and parts of the Asian islands, Southeast Asian islands. Whereas opossum refers to a whole group of animals that are found in the New World in South America, Central America, and the Virginia opossum is our only one here in North America. So it means a lot. So you have to say opossum. You can't short it, just in spite of what people do in the vernacular. These guys were like, as soon as we had European explorers coming to the New World, which of course was new to them, but not new to the indigenous people that had been here for the last 15,000 years, they were taken by this rather curious animal. And this is a plate that Audubon did in the viviparous quadrupeds of North America. And it's a very accurate, it's typical Audubon. Audubon himself might have been given to hyperbole in his writings. He might have stolen an idea or an image or two without giving an attribution or credit. He definitely had slaves in his possession from time to time. So there's some parts of his character that are not particularly nice, but an amazing recorder of the natural history of the American wilderness. So he's got these opossums in the wintertime in a persimmon tree. And it turns out that this is very accurate because opossums love persimmons, dried persimmons. As a matter of fact, sometimes persimmons are called possum apples, and with the association between these two animals. And I think I might even have an image here of persimmons and opossum in a tree modern day. Captain John Smith, none other than, Pocahontas's flame in Jamestown, had described the animal as this: an opossum hath a head like a swine and a tail like a rat, and is of the bigness of a cat, and under her belly she hath a bag, wherein she lodgeth, carrieth, and sucketh her young. Pretty much got it down in one fell swoop. And not only did he talk about it, but when you see some of the images that were sort of describing highlights of the New World, this is one that if you take a look at it, you've got an opossum hanging from the top, you've got a bison, you've got Native Americans. So these are some of the curiosities that Europeans found just fascinating when referring to the New World. So the opossum is an animal. It's about 2 feet long. It can weigh maybe up to 12 pounds. They are in captivity are inclined to get quite obese if left to it. They have this white underfur and the grizzled kind of grayish hair, guard hairs that come out. They have a pink nose, pink skin around their toes, which is really evident in the wintertime when it gets cold because they have a rich blood supply out there, and it gets pinker and pinker and redder as they're pumping blood out there. They have hairless ears that are paper thin and can be a real liability to them in the northern part of the range because they are susceptible to frostbite. And here in the lower right, you'll see their footprints, a forepaw on the top and a hind paw on the bottom. And one of the neat characteristics of these guys is that on their hind legs or hind feet, they actually have opposable big toes, very effective opposable big toes. And you can see that there's not a claw on the big toes. So in that print, you see the claws on 3 of the 4 digits, but not on that big toe. And then the front paw splays out. Superficially, the print might look like a raccoon print, but if you see that back print with that opposable big toe, that is distinctive and diagnostic for the Virginia opossum in this region. This gives you an example of them. Now, you notice that this particular animal is holding on with the opposable big toes, because if you take a look at the hind foot, you can see 4 toes showing, but not the big toe because it's actually gripping the other side of that branch. And they're fabulous climbers. They're terrible jumpers. In fact, they don't jump. If they jump, they fall, and that's probably all she wrote. But you will notice that there's something hanging off the end of them, and that is this hairless tail. And the hairless tail has a scaly skin texture to it with fine hairs, and it is prehensile. And here you see 3 little opossums that are hanging by their tail, and you might think, oh my gosh, is this the natural repose of the opossum? Absolutely not. The person who took this picture set it up. He got them to hang by their tails. It's not a posture that they want to be in. However, that tail, being prehensile, is incredibly effective for them when they go foraging up in trees. It's like an additional limb, and because it's prehensile and gripping, it's like an additional foot that can securely latch them on to a tree. So it's a pretty handy thing. And if you can take a look at the tail on the hand there, for nice comparison between fingers and tail, you get a sense of the scaly appearance of that, as well as those fine hairs that cover it. One of the theories of why it has to be scaly is that unlike a monkey, a New World monkey that has a prehensile tail, their tails are incredibly long and can wrap around a branch several times to make sure they have a secure grip. The opossum does not have that long a tail, and so it needs to be able to grip effectively with the outer third of the tail. So as these youngsters are doing hanging there. And so it's a really interesting attribute. You know, we don't have a whole lot of critters in the mammalian world that have a prehensile tail. There's prehensile tailed porcupines. There are, in fact, opossums. There are New World monkeys. But, you know, it's an attribute that's not often selected for, and yet clearly a great survival advantage to the opossum. This is an image of their skull. Skull is notable for a couple things. When you take a side look at that mandible, they've got a mouthful of teeth, 50 teeth, the most of any North American mammal. You can see all those incisor teeth in the front of the jaw. You can see that huge canine tooth sticking up. You got a gap between that and the first molar, and then a whole bunch of slicing molars, but also molars that do double and triple duty. And now they're not necessarily the grinding molars that you would expect to find in an herbivore. They're much more like you'd find in an omnivore, like a raccoon. You can see the long rostrum they have on the top view looking down at it. And generally, the longer a mammal's rostrum, the longer its snout, the better its sense of smell, because the more opportunity there's to have tissue, olfactory tissue, that can sample, chemically sample the odors that are coming in to the nasal chamber. But the other thing to look at is when you take a look just to the right of those enormous orbits for their eyes, their brain case is awfully small, a lot smaller than, let's say, an equivalent sized raccoon. And a lot of people have accused opossums of being dumb. We'll address that as we get further on in this program. If you take a look head on at an opossum, though, you get a lot of a sort of a sense of what senses are most important to it. Again, we have another opossum in wintertime. It's chilly, and you see how pink its toes are and how pink that nose is. First of all, you notice the beady eyes. They don't have the largest eyes in the world, and their pupils, which you can't see because the eyes are black, are tiny. They're like little pinpricks. Their vision, we think, is monochromatic, and it's, let's just say, not their most important sense. Their most important senses are pointing right at you, that snout and that nose. They've got a fabulous sense of smell. Also, you take a look at all of those whiskers that perfectly surround the muzzle and see how long they are. Well, that's an tactile receptors that allow them to fine tune where their face is going with respect to going for particularly live prey. And then you see the large ears. They have a good sense of smell, a great sense of smell, good sense of hearing. They have an incredible sense of touch around their face. I can't speak to their sense of taste, though a lot of people say they taste good. We'll get that into that later. So it seems that those senses are most appropriate to it. This is an animal that doesn't go around chasing things a long distance away. It goes through life kind of walking around, waddling, if you will, and using those senses that afford to it, all based on its head, to see if it can find things that it might want to eat. Evolutionary history. Well, these guys go back a long way. We know that from the early Cretaceous and perhaps even earlier, there were marsupial mammals. And if you take a look at these images of fossil marsupials from the early Cretaceous, they kind of look opossum-like. So this game plan has been around for a long, long time. And that means if they were around in the early Cretaceous, they were around at the same time as the non-avian dinosaurs. So they were around when T-Rex was around, and Stegosaurus and the giant sauropods. We think that being furred and warm-blooded, that perhaps they were nocturnal, then they were operating in the shadows or at night when some of these other dinosaurs were not active, and that allowed them to explore and take advantage of niches that the dinosaurs weren't taking advantage of, or perhaps maybe were just too small for the dinosaurs. Though no doubt they became prey to an awful lot of the small, fleet-footed, two-legged carnivorous dinosaurs. Think about a Campsognathus or something like that would be a compy, as they called them in Jurassic Park. Maybe would go after them. And if we take a look at their evolutionary history, all of the marsupials that are alive today, we see, are found in South America, with the exception of the opossums of Mexico and North America, as well as Australia. And there's a rich diversity of mammals that we find. I mean, everything from marsupials, rather, that we find, everything from kangaroos to Tasmanian devils to wombats to marsupial mice and marsupial shrews and what look like marsupial mole rats. And, it seems like they adapted to a ton of niches, but they did so in areas where there weren't placental mammals. And there's probably a good reason for that. But if you take a look at the cladogram on the far right, it plays out against time. You see the Mesozoic on top and the Cenozoic. You see the Cretaceous, and you see some of these marsupials have a lineage that goes back to the early Cretaceous, many of them appearing then in the late Cretaceous. And then there's that big dotted line that separates the Mesozoic from the Cenozoic, the Cretaceous from the Paleogene. And what was that big black line? Well, that's when an asteroid smashed into planet Earth in the Yucatan Peninsula 66 million years ago. Earth had a rather bad day. It obliterated a huge amount of both the asteroid and the Earth's crust in that location, sending up plumes of debris and toxic sulfur dioxide and all sorts of stuff that set off wildfires and choked the atmosphere of the entire planet in a very short period of time and for a very long time, maybe a period of months, if not years. And it killed off all the non-avian dinosaurs. It killed off a lot of plants. It killed off a lot of organisms. But it turns out that these early marsupials, as well as early placental mammals, were able to survive. And interesting theory about why they survived and then were able to radiate rapidly and take over all the available niches that the dinosaurs had been filling. And one of it is a fungal infection scenario. That is, that the world would have been awash in fungi in those years following the impact, as you've got just decay going on everywhere. Mold spores and fungal spores choking the atmosphere. Well, cold-blooded or ectothermic animals like reptiles have a lot of difficulty dealing with fungal infections, whereas warm-blooded animals, endotherms like mammals and the avian dinosaurs, birds, would be much better protected from it. And that's perhaps why they could scavenge or find their way through that couple-year period it took to be able to survive. And then their world was their oyster. You had all of these available niches as these ecosystems started rebounding, and it was mammals that were in a position to take advantage of them and radiate out and fill all the ecological niches as the dinosaurs. Anyway, it's a really interesting theory, tough to prove, but one reason why the reptiles just didn't radiate out and have dominion over the earth as they did when they were reptiles, when they were dinosaurs. One of the things that explains the distribution of the marsupial mammals is if you take a look at the late Cretaceous, 94 million years ago, you can see that South America, actually, there's a time when it's connected to Antarctica and Antarctica connected to Australia, but those land masses are separated from everywhere else. And so the marsupials had dominion over those lands, and that's where they did their rapid evolution and expansion into niches at the end of the dinosaur era. So plate tectonics has a huge impact upon the distribution of plants and animals on this planet. Oops, I went the wrong way. Okay, so let's go back to our opossum. Our opossum, again, in the United States, is our only marsupial. And all the marsupial mammals are given that name because they do possess a marsupium, which is the scientific name for the pouch on the female's belly. The light gray in this image indicates the original range of the opossum, and the dark shading indicates where it has expanded its range to. And it definitely has done well with the human imprint upon the land. It likes a more open landscape that we have created, our farmlands. And it turns out that as a kind of a omnivorous opportunist, it does quite well scavenging its way through the human landscape. Again, this is the current range, and you can see that the opossum gets down into Mexico and Central America. And also, by the time you get down to Central America, you get the range of a lot of other, there's another, some discrepancy or some question about how many opossum species are down there, but I think it's something in the neighborhood of almost 100 different kinds of mouse opossums and other opossums that you find in Central and South America. Okay, opossum reproduction. This is cool. So this is the R or X-rated version of this particular program, but you're looking on that left image of the southbound end of a northbound male opossum. And you can see it has extended its penis, and its penis has a rather interesting shape. It's forked. And the early explorers who saw this thought it was the most odd thing, and they were trying to think, well, what could possibly be an appropriate receptacle for a forked penis? And there was a theory for a while there in the 1700s and 1600s that the males would mate with the nostrils of the female, and then the females would sneeze their youngsters into their pouch. Anyway, curious theory, not true. On the right side, you actually see an image of the female apparatus of an opossum. They actually have paired vagina, and actually they've got a third vagina too. So I'll talk about that. But so when they're actually mating, the forked penis fits very nicely into the right and the left vagina. And then you'll see that they've got a pair of ovaries, and you can see that the uterus is a pair of uterus. And so the youngsters will develop in there, but then from the uterus, they go into that vaginal sinus, which then opens back into the urogenital sinus or cloaca on their way out. It's pretty complicated plumbing, but seems to work really well for them. But if you take a look at the nature of the uteri are really very small, and they're not designed to harbor youngsters for a very long period of time. And this is one of the things that we find in the marsupials and the opossum in particular, that they're having no placenta or having no connection between the larva, the youngster, and its maternal blood supply. The amount of nutrition it's got is in the form of the yolk, so that when there's ovulation, that ovum has a really large yolk sac, and that's going to actually power development for the first 12 days. But then after 12 days, you need to be born because you've gotten to the end of the road in terms of how you can be nourished within your mother's body. And so, needless to say, when they're born, they're very small. So when they're born, the destination, you're looking again at the back foot of an opossum, you see the clawless, opposable big toe, but right above it, you see the marsupium, which is really just a fold of skin filled with nice warm fur. That fur is nice and woolly and white in there. And in there is a horseshoe-shaped pattern of teats, 13 in all. And so the mother doesn't put the babies in there. The babies actually have to, once they emerge from that urogenital sinus or opening, they have to climb up on the mother's fur and find their way to the pouch all on their own, which is a pretty remarkable thing for something that's about the size of a honeybee. When it's born, it's basically, its forelegs are developed in these little paddle-like front feet that do have deciduous claws on them that it can use to climb. Its eyes are just spots underneath the skin. It's not going by vision, it's going strictly by smell, and the mother has licked a path that the little embryo, the little hatchling, birthling, whatever you want to call it, uses to find its way inside to the pouch. And so once inside the pouch, they find a nipple, and they latch onto the nipple, and then the nipple starts swelling in their mouth, and that's the docking mechanism that keeps them securely in the pouch. And they don't suckle. As a matter of fact, when you have them in captivity now and you're trying to raise orphans, we used to try and use these little pet nursers, and they would kind of adjust to it in time. But nowadays, a modern rehab facility actually has a syringe, and you have a catheter, and you have a known depth to get to the stomach, and you basically feed it by gavage. You just insert that thing to the stomach and then depress the syringe and get the allocated amount of milk into the stomach, withdraw it, you're done. Pretty quick business. But this is the nature. Take a look at that embryo on the left. The eye is just a spot. It's not a functional visual device, but you see the opening to the nostril is very apparent because it's doing all its breathing through its nostril. And so the sense of smell, and then you really can't see that they probably have fallen off by this image, but there would have been deciduous claws on the end of the clearly visible little toe nubs on the forepaws. And in that pouch they stay, and they stay for the next 3 months. They get larger and larger and larger. In the middle picture, you see they still haven't really started growing hair, but you can see they look like little opossums, hairless opossums. You can see the development of the ears and the development of the eyes, and the snout is getting longer. And you can see now that they're also grabbing on with their forefeet. And then the bottom picture, you can see a mom who's got a pouch full of youngsters. So these guys are just about the age when they're starting to open up their eyes. Um, they're still entirely dependent upon milk. However, if mom comes upon something like carrion that she starts eating, they might actually maybe try and venture out and get a bite or two. Um, so this one is a little bit out of place, but again, you see the youngsters in there, and you can see how when they're very small, how the marsupium draws up almost like a purse string around them and helps keep them inside. See, this is two different litters put together. You see the tiny ones with no hair, the other ones that look like they have a 5 o'clock shadow, that they're getting a little bit older, but none of these guys can see. And by the way, if they come into captivity and they can't see, and then you take on the job of feeding them, what we found in the old days when we were doing wildlife rehab at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History is that they would end up being incredibly tame for their entire life and tractable. Now, as they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, you can see this gets to be a bigger problem. You can see how much difficulty this poor female's having walking. She has to do the high step to be able to accommodate this bulge. So it gets a little uncomfortable, but change is about to happen. And here's a great picture that Wendy, our own Wendy Donkin, took in her backyard of an opossum that she encountered in her yard. And as that pouch becomes just too small for these guys, and as they have the capability and the interest in sampling the food that their mom's eating, they start climbing up on her back and they catch a free ride on her back. And they hold on with their tails and they hold on with their claws. And it's still quite a load for the mom, but it makes it a little bit easier, at least to swing your feet. And I love this picture because you've got them all hanging on, but if you take a look at the nose of the mother, there are two tails that cross that give her the look of a handlebar mustache. I love that picture. And soon thereafter, these guys are going to go their own way. And they're weaned as they get to that age where on the back, and they're not going back into the pouch for food. There's no room for all of them. They're starting to feed on exactly what their mother's feeding on. So the essence of their ecology, these guys we know are nomadic. They don't have a specific home range territory necessarily. They're opportunistic omnivores. They eat just about anything. They're generalists. That goes along in that same vein, and they're scavengers. And they can be very effective scavengers, finding the remains of an animal that was perhaps of a kill of something else. They will sometimes scavenge roadkill. And unfortunately, because like a lot of animals that tend to be nocturnal, bright lights tend to get an animal to freeze in its tracks. And oftentimes they don't know that they're in danger from an oncoming car, and they become roadkill themselves. It's kind of a sad thing that for a lot of people, the only way they see opossums are in 2 dimensions on our highway, not in 3. They are common in a wide variety of habitats, including cities and suburbs and your backyard, no matter where your backyard might be. And they've been expanding their range northward and westward and by introduction elsewhere. So kind of an interesting animal, an animal you're apt to encounter in your backyard, and it's one that I think is pretty cool. In terms of what's on the diet, eggs. They love eggs. So if they find particularly ground nesting birds, they're going to do what they can to get into that nest, with turkey nest or anything else that's on the ground. Or if they can encounter climbing up in a sapling, a nest that's low in a sapling, they've got the ability as a climber to be able to reach where nests are. They're not really in a position to catch birds, because birds are usually fleet-footed as well as able to, and most can fly away. But if they can get their feet on them, their mouth on them, they will certainly eat birds. They eat lots of rodents. and they're shuffling, kind of waddling across the landscape with their highly developed sense of smell. Sometimes they encounter a mouse nest, or they encounter a rat, or they encounter a chipmunk, and they are clearly able to, with all those teeth, to quickly dispatch it and consume it. Huge consumer of invertebrates of all sorts, including things like ticks. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Big consumer of reptiles, of snakes, as well as amphibians, fruit, vegetation, carrion, pet food, and we'll talk about pet food being outside, as well as if they can get into a trash can, they're going to eat your trash. They might not be able to get out of your trash can, so you might find them in your trash can in the morning. Just simply put the can outside and let them leave. Fortunately, most dumpster bins that we have these days are designed such that most wild animals can't really get into them. Some intriguing behaviors. They've got a huge gape. They can almost get that mouth open, it seems, close to a 90-degree angle. And you can see that these little guys are showcasing their teeth. The teeth aren't that big yet, but they're showcasing what will be that array of 50 very, very sharp teeth. And so if you encounter one and it feels that it can't run or waddle away from you, and it stands its ground, one of the first things it will do is it will hiss at you with a wide open mouth, showing all that pink flesh as well as its teeth. But if that doesn't work, they engage in a really curious behavior for which they are famous, and that is thanatosis, or playing dead. So it's kind of like they go in a catatonic state, and they're immobile, and they're oozing secretions from glands that pretty foul smelling, and by all accounts, they look like they're dead. And the theory would be that if you're a predator, an active predator that normally kills your prey, that if you come upon this and scavenging is not in your job description, that you would be put off by the smell and the strange behavior of the opossum and leave it alone. And does it work? You might say, this sounds so stupid. There's no way it can work. Well, clearly it does work. And how can we say it works? Well, we can infer that by the fact that they do it. If it was maladaptive, if they did it and it served them no purpose, all the ones that did it would have been eaten by their predators a long time ago, and it would have caused the extinction of the behavior. But they still do it. They all do it. So it's very much an adaptation, a functional adaptation to help defend themselves. Ticks and opossums. They can get ticks like any other mammal and other organisms as well. Birds can certainly get ticks, and reptiles can get ticks. Ticks aren't all that picky unless you're a specific species of ticks that have specific hosts, like the black-legged tick. It has been widely said that opossums can consume 5,500 ticks each a year, which would make them a positive tick hoover, a vacuum of ticks. However, the study that this was based on was suggesting that, that they're doing this by licking the larval ticks off of their hair and off their body. You just got an appearance from my wife, Doris, in the background. And they're certainly able to do that. They do extensive grooming of their fur, and they can remove a lot of ectoparasites that way. But the study that was done was an extrapolation based upon a small sample size in captivity, based upon the number of ticks larvae that should have been on the opossums and were not shed, gorged with blood. Anyway, do they eat ticks? Yes. Are they a significant control of ticks? I'd love to say they are, but we really can't say that. That's probably an urban legend. But they're not susceptible. They don't factor in the transmission of Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever and some of the tick-borne diseases that we associate as being really harmful to humans. Opossums and venom. I said before that opossums like to eat snakes. Well, not so much in Ohio, because we know in the greater Cleveland area, if you were worried about venomous snakes, ah, you can breathe a sigh of relief because we have none in Cuyahoga County. We do have a little guy called the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. It's found in select locations in Trumbull and Ashtabula County and out in some of the prairie areas of northwestern Ohio. But it's an endangered species in Ohio and soon to be a federally endangered species. Rarely grows to 3 feet long, and it's not a concern to humans. But opossums certainly could eat them. But if you get into southern Ohio, where we have copperheads, and in extreme southern Ohio, where we have timber rattlesnakes, it turns out that opossums can and do eat them. And you might think to yourself, well, what about the venom? Well, if the snake bites them, doesn't that immobilize them, paralyze them, kill them? And the answer is that they have a surprising immunity to the venom of pit vipers. And if you take a look at this timber rattlesnake there, right between and a little below a line from the eye to the nostril is a pit. And that conceals a heat sensing organ that's really important to the snake for able to find its warm-blooded prey. But it is a rattlesnake with a fully developed rattle on the other end of it. And if it bit the opossum would not succumb to the venom. So that's a rather interesting thing. So in those areas that have a lot of venomous snakes and people don't like venomous snakes, opossums are very beneficial. This image talks about opossums and rabies. There is none. They don't get it. Certainly they could be bitten by rabid animals, but their metabolic rate and their body temperature is lower than other equivalent sized mammals, as well as their metabolic rate. And apparently rabies, that's not a favorable environment for rabies, just as you don't find rabies in reptiles. And birds have a body temperature that's too high. So they don't apparently factor in either succumbing to rabies or being a vector for rabies. So that's a good thing. Opossums feature highly in cultural history. I mean, think about Pogo, one of the most famous, a great cartoon strip by the fabulous cartoonist Walt Kelly, and his protagonist was the opossum, Pogo, and I love the quote, "Yep, son, we have met the enemy, and he is us." Very famous from environmental circles, a very famous strip right there. We have Heidi the cross-eyed opossum. And actually if you go through Google cross-eyed opossums, you'll find lots of them. There was a Clarence the cross-eyed opossum and many others. And you say, wow, that poor animal, what happened to it? Is this a congenital defect? And actually, no, this is an overfed captive opossum. It turns out that any opossum, if it's fed a high-fat diet and doesn't have that metabolic rate to burn up all that food, as it puts on fat, it forms these big wads of fat immediately behind its hind legs, kind of like its armpits, and deposits fat around the eyes until it protrudes on the outside and makes it look like it's cross-eyed. Very, very curious thing. Not a sign of a healthy opossum. This animal needed to go on a diet. Here in Ohio, we had the rally possum. We had an opossum that was found at a Cleveland Browns game, and it was found in the stands. And this enterprising gentleman picked it up by the tail, which he can do and do so pretty safely that the animal's not going to swing around and try and bite you. And they successfully got it to safety. And the Browns went on to win the game. So everybody talked about the fact that maybe this was our lucky opossum. And all of a sudden you had lucky possum jerseys and rally possum stickers. In a couple of places in the US, they have possum drops that celebrate special things, whether it's ushering in the new year. Brasstown, North Carolina, and Tallapoosa, Georgia has Spencer, the famous opossum, though Spencer's got to be like Punxsutawney It turns out that opossums only have a functional lifespan in the wild of maybe 2 to 3 years, and they have very, very high infant mortality. And basically, you see signs of old age kicking in, like kidney disease, when they get to be 4, and they rarely exceed the age of 5. So when you have an animal with a famous moniker like Spencer, or in the case of a groundhog like Punxsutawney, they groom their replacement. So there's a steady stream of Spencer, the opossums, I'm sure, in Tallapoosa. And I am assured that no opossums are harmed in those opossum drops. This is a curious thing that Benjamin Harrison, as president, had to tame opossums, Mr. Reciprocity and Mr. Protection. Apparently, he was big on tariffs. And he believed in the novelty and all the wonderful attributes of these animals. As again, if they are hand raised, if you get them before their eyes are open, they will be very tractable and handleable pretty much through their lives. Oops, sorry, wrong way. There's a monument to the opossum in Cottondale, Florida, recognizing its novelty as our only marsupial, but also its importance to Native Americans and other peoples as a food source and as just an all-around special creature. And speaking of food source, opossums have been on the menu time immemorial. Certainly Native Americans use them as an important and readily available food, and pretty easy to catch if you get them on the ground. Just like for any other sort of mesopredator, raccoons and the like, these animals would have been consumed often. You've got a whole ode by James Edgerton to the Thanksgiving opossum. I mean, Thanksgiving wouldn't be Thanksgiving without opossum on the table. And if you go to your let's see, I'm going to look it up right now just so that nobody, I've got my copy of Joy of Cooking right here. This was the edition, paperback edition that was done in, let me see if I can find it. It was published in 1975, and sure enough, it's got the recipe for opossum. Curious recipe, though. Listen to this. If possible, trap the opossum and feed it on milk and cereals for 10 days before killing it. Clean it, but do not skin it. Treat as for pig by immersing the unskinned animal in water just below the boiling point. Test frequently by plucking at the hair. When it slips out, readily remove the opossum from the water and scrape. While scraping repeatedly, pour cold water over the surface of the animal. Remove those nasty small red glands in the small of the back and under each foreleg between shoulder and ribs. Par blanch about 20 minutes each in 2 or 3 changes of water, and then roast as for pork. Pretty tasty, huh? So it turns out that opossums were very, very popular, particularly in Southern cuisine. But I mean, if you make it, in the small game cookery section of the Joy of Cooking, then clearly, there's a larger market for it. And I think the Rombauers came from Missouri, but whether that meant that opossum was popular there. It certainly was very popular in the South. And it was very important to African Americans, particularly those who were enslaved or those that were dirt farmers, and they had to augment what they had with what they could catch. And so they came up with ways of preparing opossum, preparing opossums. And that spilled over into a white tradition of having possum dinners. And unfortunately, over time, really got associated with Jim Crow laws. And there's a really curious picture. This is a dinner of almost 500 people down in Atlanta, and it was hosting President-elect Taft, and he was trying to solidify support in the South. And so this was a formal possum dinner. Unfortunately, the notion of a possum dinner does have some connection to sort of white supremacy and Jim Crow laws. And even though it was associated with Black culture, it was co-opted by these possum dinners by whites. Problems with opossums. Now, possums basically are omnivorous. There might be things in your gardens that they would like to eat. I know that our blueberry bush, we're not very good about harvesting the blueberries. We generally let the wildlife have it. So we have a steady stream of blue jays and robins and catbirds that are going in and out of there. We do have some chipmunks and squirrels that are grabbing the bluebirds that have fallen to the ground. The wild turkey, before it took its dust bath, we think was pulling at blueberries. But certainly the blueberries, if they are ripe and they fall to the ground, that would be a perfect food for an opossum. But this shows a real problem for, there's huge issues in this image. One is that this is an exterior area and someone's putting out cat food. And they're feeding a cat outside. Why is that a problem? Because we know that cats are incredibly damaging predators on our native birds and small mammal populations. Like they might be the single biggest cause of mortality in birds in North America, killing perhaps 1 billion or more birds every year. Huge. These are our pet cats allowed to go outside. And so I would encourage everybody who's got a cat to keep it inside. Please, please, please. Secondly, if you did have an animal, any pet, dog or cat, and you had it outside, if you put food out that you leave out, you are inviting all of these omnivorous mammals or carnivorous mammals, foxes would certainly come in as well, to share in the bounty. And in so doing, those animals lose their fear of humans and are more likely to come back again and more likely to approach human habitation as a source of food. And then that brings up all sorts of troubles. And then more likely to have an interaction between your pet and the wild animal, who usually wants to just do their own thing. So do not put pet food out. Please do not do that. Bad idea. Let these guys stay wild and let them do their thing. Okay, so I've been rambling on here for quite some time. We're going to wrap it up here. The takeaway about an opossum, particularly as it concerns our nature in my backyard movement. I think a Virginia opossum is an ideal visitor to your yard. They're quiet. They don't pick fights. They don't leave foul odors. They don't dig or claw. Instead, they waddle in, eat a rodent, scarf down some insects and snails, munch on fallen fruit, clean up any leftovers in the dog food bowl. Yeah, that probably we can eliminate that. And then they lumber away, and that's it. They get unfairly blamed for damage done by other animals. And they are part of an ancient lineage that has survived to the present day due to their amazing adaptations and adaptability. They might not have the largest brain in the mammalian world, but you can't argue about an animal who has members of its family that go back to the late Cretaceous over 66 million years ago. So the attributes of this animal have been highly conserved in evolution. And clearly their adaptability, no matter what Mother Nature has thrown at us in terms of environmental change, has left them to be survivors and here to this day. So the opossum, they are the totally awesome Virginia opossums. And that's my program. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm sticking to. Now, do they play a role in disease transmission? They can get diseases. Their role in actually transmission of diseases, not quite clear, not so much a significant problem for us as it might be for unvaccinated pets, but they're not susceptible to the distempers that dogs and cats are susceptible to. Again, rabies is not an issue. So for the most part, they're pretty benign. And part of the reason is that even though they're a mammal and they're in that mesopredator size range, because they have such a different background as placental mammals, and these disease lines sometimes they emerge in different evolutionary lines. there's not a whole lot of stuff that they're going to be transmitting. So, and again, since they're not a big factor in ticks and transmission, whether they're the vacuum cleaner of ticks or not, they're not a big factor in terms of passing on tick-borne diseases. This is a pretty cool animal. And the last time I gave a talk when I was gainfully employed at the Museum of Natural History, I was actually holding an opossum, and that was Linda. And this is Linda the opossum. And she was a wonderful opossum that had a nice 4.5-year lifespan. You can see the size of her pupil there, just so that gray ring inside the eye. And Linda lived a nice life at the museum. She was recovered from the pouch of a road-killed mother, and that's a very common way that orphaned opossums come into a rehab center. Mom gets hit in the head by a car, and the babies in the pouch are still alive. Someone goes driving past that dead opossum and sees the movement around her belly, and then goes, rescues the babies out of the pouch and takes them to a rehab center. And if you go to a place like Penitentiary Glen at Lake Metro Parks, generally this time of year, you'll find that they've got aquaria filled with, or terraria filled with baby opossums. So they're really cool animals. She became famous during the COVID era because when we closed to the public in late March or mid-March of 2020, because of the pandemic, we did a lot of stuff online. And one of the most popular things we did was walkabouts with Linda. And we would put a harness and leash on Linda, and we would walk around the museum with her. And she would encounter curators who would talk about the specimens. And as Linda would eye the big bones of the dinosaurs, probably thinking, could I eat that? Anyway, it was a wonderful way to showcase what the museum had to offer. And Linda was our guide. So very, very cool. So I don't know if there's any questions here. You can put them in the chat, or there's so few of us. I am going to conclude the program and get out of that and get back to, I want to quit sharing. Let's see, where am I? Stop share. And then if you want to unmute and ask some questions, we can have a little opossum conversation. Oh, before I do that though, I need to, a little bit order of business. We will reschedule Matt in the good bug, bad bug program at a future date. But on the 13th of August, for the August edition of Brown Bagging It From My Backyard, we're going to have a really special program. Lisa Rainsong will be talking about gardening for a concert. What you can do in terms of your backyard and your landscape to make it conducive to those things that sing, that stridulate, that call, that rub their legs together. All of the wonderful sounds of summer and early fall, whether it's insect or bird, and the things that you can do in your backyard to encourage it. That should be a fabulous one. You don't want to miss it. Okay, folks, thanks for being here. It's been a really intimate group, and I hope you have become a fan of opossums. And anybody got a question? Fire away.
Thanks, Harvey. This was great.
Yep. Thank you, Harvey. Always wonderful. And I guess we'll look at opossums differently now. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just as we talk about the importance in nature in my backyard about knowing the scientific name of a plant, just so because a plant, an animal, anything can have a multitude of names, and they might mean the same thing and they might not mean the same thing, because except for birds, there's not really been that much of an effort to standardize common names. So it's always important to know the name. And in the case of the opossum, it is a very distinct organism as opposed to the opossums of Australia. So yeah, it means a lot.
Okay. Again, thank you.
Anything else?
Thanks for using my photo.
Yeah,
pretty
thank you.
great, Wendy.
It
Yeah.
was a fun sighting for sure. Walked right in front of my door on the patio, and I thought it was a shaggy dog. And then I saw, oh, it's a mama. And I followed her out and took her picture. It was fun.
Can you
Got it.
get a
I
picture of
find-
that turkey in the dust bath?
Isn't that fun?
Yeah, get a picture of that, Harvey.
Well, I've got video of it, yeah.
Oh,
So
wow.
in terms of, and we've been kind of watching things in our backyard, and I have this just
Ah.
from this recent month. We have a wild turkey from that turkey that was doing the dust bath. The red-shouldered hawk has been sitting on our shed roof the last 2 days, and it lost one of its primary feathers. A great horned owl lost a primary feather back in the tree lawn. And the pileated woodpecker, the only food that we put out is jelly rather, for the Orioles, and we still have the suet out. So we had a pileated woodpecker that comes in routinely, and
Wow.
the female lost one of her primary feathers. So yes, I got my feather collection going too. And don't tell the United States Fish and Wildlife Service about it.
I was going to ask about your permit.
But it's fun to see that, it's one of the fun things about having nature in your backyard is that once you attract all these things, is going out and actually looking for the organisms, or just looking for the signs, that whether it's tracks, whether it's molted feathers, whether it's a sign that, an act of predation happened and you find pieces, parts. It's all good.
We
Thank
Well,
love
shall
it.
we call it?
Yep.
Shall we
let's
call it a
call
day?
Let's
Thank
call
you.
For the
Bye,
closing order?
everybody.